I'd like to thank Joe and the others who helped organize this wonderful conference. I really appreciate your hospitality and excellent organization. I really appreciated the last talk. I think genetic entropy is a really powerful evidence for intelligent design. But I do think there is one example where you can have a really big increase in information in a small amount of time. And I think it's a creation conference. And I think you've done very well the last few days, like running a marathon, taking in all this information. But I hope that encourages you and equips you. This is the last talk, so well done for surviving this far. And in this last talk, I really want to encourage you about God's goodness and God's love for man, because I want to give you a quick overview of the amazing ways in which God has designed this world specifically for the needs of man. Sadly, we don't hear any of this in modern society, in the media, in television programs, and we can be influenced by this, but I just want to give you some insight into God's goodness. First of all, an illustration. This is a picture of my next car, Ferrari. And if you were to go to this motor car with the designer, the Italian designer of this motor car, if you were to say to them, I think this steering wheel fits my hands, but I think that's a coincidence. I think that was just, I don't think you did that deliberately. The designer would say, no, I did that deliberately. It's designed for your hands. And if you said the gear stick, I think that was just a lucky coincidence that fits in my hand, he would say, no. I thought where to put it, what size to make it. And if you said the seat, yeah, it's very comfortable, but I think that was a lucky coincidence. I don't think you really put any thought into that. And he would say, well, first of all, he would say he's part of a big team of designers. You wouldn't believe how many designers go into what's called the ergonomics, the ergonomic design of a car. Often you think of the engine designers and the structural designers, but many designers work on the ergonomics, the designing the seat, the handles, the door handles, the mirror, to get everything finely tuned for the needs of the human designer. We take it for granted, but a huge effort goes into that. And the point I want to make today, if you think about it, as I will show, it's amazing how God has fine-tuned so many things on this planet for mankind, just, in fact, even more so than for that motor car. This is the biblical foundation for what I'm saying. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18, it says, God has designed the world to be inhabited. God deliberately made the earth for life. It's not just a planet. God did it deliberately. And another verse I would draw your attention to is Psalm 8, verse 5, where it says, what is man that you are mindful of him? When I designed the bicycles for the Team GB, for the Olympics, I had to be mindful of all of the needs of the cyclists, how they would hold the handlebars, how they would sit on the saddle, how they would ride the bicycle. But God has been mindful of everything that humans would ever do, whether it's putting your washing out in the garden, or transportation, or fuel, building materials. God thought of everything, as I will show you in this talk. There's going to be two parts. The first part are 5 aspects of how God has designed the earth and the earth ecosystem for man. If anything, I think the second part is the most encouraging part, because it gets down to the nitty-gritty detail of how God has designed every single thing in this planet for the needs of mankind. But we go through, first of all, the 5 of the Earth ecosystem. What we find with the Earth, with the planetary system, is that the Earth goes in a circular orbit around the Sun. The other planets go in an elliptical orbit, but the Earth goes in a circular orbit. And And that is not something just to take for granted. When I designed spacecraft, I had to shoot them up into orbit, and to get the exact velocity and positions to get the satellites to go into orbit around the Earth. It requires precision calculations. And it's amazing how God has put the Earth into that exact orbit that gets the right heat and light for Earth. And then we find that the Earth has the right rate of spin. If the Earth spun faster than a 24-hour day, we would get extreme weather events. But if the Earth spun slower than 24 hours, then the Earth would heat up too much during the day, and it would cool down too much during the night. And it just so happens that 24 hours is just the right amount of time for sleep. Despite what your teenage children might say, 24 hours a day is just right for getting a night's sleep. And that's not a coincidence. Isaac Newton, the great scientist, said, this did not happen by chance. And then we could think of the moon. The moon is an amazingly large satellite of the Earth, just the right size to create moderate tides, not so big that you get tidal waves, but big enough to clean the beaches and also to oxygenate the water. And also, importantly, tides around the world are very useful for fishermen and other people to harvest food from the seas. And there's no doubt that God thought of that detail of helping man to harvest food when he created the moon and tides. Then secondly, we have a designer atmosphere. We have what's called the troposphere, that thin layer of atmosphere around the Earth, ideal for trapping heat from the sun. But we also have a stratosphere, another layer of atmosphere above the lower one, and that's just right for absorbing UV radiation. But then we find that air has many functions. Air is one of these things we just take for granted. Air is transparent, we can see through it, so we forget it's there. But air is amazing. When I'm teaching my students at the university, I tell them it's very hard to design a component for more than one main function. You might be able to do 2 or 3 if you're very careful. But amazingly, God has designed air to do so many things. I just run through a list of all the things air can do. Air is very good at transmitting sound. It's designed perfectly so that sound can be transmitted. Also transmits smell. It also so happens that air is transparent. It didn't have to be transparent. Imagine if air had a pink color and we all saw each other in a pink air all the time. But God knew that transparent air is what we need. But in fact, it's even more clever than that, because God can give air a color. Today we've been appreciating a blue sky, because by the scattering of light, God creates a blue sky. God can create a red sunset. That's incredible, that with this transparent gas, God can actually give it a color. So that is a very clever thing to do that. And then we find that air has just the right amount of oxygen to breathe, not so much that you get fires around the world, not so little that we can't run a park run very fast. Then air has carbon dioxide for the plants. It has the right density. It's dense enough that birds can fly and turbines can turn, but it's not so dense that we can't run through the air. And then it holds water vapor, which is a very special thing. In this room, the air in this room has water in it, because air is like a sponge and it absorbs water. So this room is full of water vapor. So air is a very special substance. God has thought of all of our needs. He knew that you would put washing out in your garden, and that the air would dry that washing. He thought of that, and that's how he designed the density and the air wind and air. And he thought of all those other needs to give us the air which we need. But then we have designer gas cycles. There is an oxygen cycle where animals need oxygen for respiration, and plants make oxygen as a waste product. But on the other hand, plants need carbon dioxide in photosynthesis to make food, but animals produce that carbon dioxide as a waste product. So we see this balance and interdependence of design. And unlike human designers, we see complete recycling in creation. I try to recycle metal, I try to recycle other things, but no engineer can perform complete recycling. Yet God can completely recycle oxygen and carbon dioxide. And it's amazing how robust God has made the world. Sometimes we forget just how robust God has done it. God has created so many things to produce oxygen. Did you know there are 3 trillion trees on Earth producing 200 billion tons of oxygen each year? God did that, so we have this robust atmosphere. I think half of those are in Norway and Sweden, half of those trees. And also there's algae producing over 300 billion tons of oxygen each year. God did that we might be able to fill the world and have technology without worrying about a lack of oxygen. And then we see a designer water cycle. And remarkably, we have a very accurate description of the water cycle in the book of Job. It says, "For God draws up water, which the clouds drop down and pour abundantly on man," especially if you live in Norway. And that is actually a very accurate description, because water vapor does rise from the oceans and the lakes, and it does form into clouds, and it gets blown over the land, and then it drops down, it gets percolated, and it rises up in streams and rivers. And one thing we take for granted today, because we have our water supplies and pipes, years ago, people appreciated that they had a local stream, a local river, so God gave a local water supply to all the people in every valley, in every area of the world, fresh water. Then the wastewater goes back to the sea, complete recycling, and then fresh water is brought back again. The water cycle is a wonderful means by which God delivers designer water literally to our doorstep. And like air, water has many functions. Obviously, it's essential to life, but have you ever stopped to think that water is transparent? It didn't have to be transparent. It could have had a color, but it doesn't. It's odorless, doesn't have a smell, and it's tasteless. It doesn't have a taste. It could have had a taste, but God knew that we needed refreshing water, refreshing with a shower. He knew that we needed clear, tasteless water for cooking. Imagine cooking if water had a permanent smell and a permanent taste. It would affect everything that you cooked. So water is a wonderful gift for people, for man to cook. And not only that, but water is ideal for cooking because it boils just at the right temperature. It's ideal for dissolving other things. We saw sugar being dissolved earlier, but water is a very good substance for dissolving many things. So it's ideal for cooking. And when God created water, he was thinking of everyone who would ever cook and everything they would need for that. Then you find that water is ideal for marine life because it holds oxygen, and the water forms ice on top, so that in the lakes, in Norway and the sea, the ice goes on the top and it doesn't kill the life underneath. So water has many functions. As an expert in design, I stand in awe of the Creator, that he can do so many things with water and air. And when you think water and air, those things we thought were so simple, we just take for granted, but they're not simple. And God has done amazing things with those two substances. Then we find there's a designer food cycle. God has designed an interdependent ecosystem where you have producers, consumers, and decomposers. And they're interdependent because the bacteria, the decomposers, they need plant life and animal life to die, but the animals need the plants to produce food and sugar, and the plants need the bacteria to fix the soil. And so you see this amazing interdependence. And there are many specific examples of interdependence in the world's ecosystem. One of the most beautiful would be the interdependence between insects and plants, the way insects need plants for food, but plants need the insects for pollination, and many other examples could be seen. We can see God's great wisdom and handiwork in design, in creation. But now I want to come to the second part. And as I said before, in some ways, this is incredibly encouraging for a Christian, and I feel very sad that children in schools don't hear this part of the lecture unless I go to visit this school. I do visit quite a few schools in the UK, Christian schools and non-Christian schools, and I give this kind of talk, and the children say, why haven't we heard this before? This is really interesting. So 5 aspects of God's detailed provision for man and mindfulness of man. First of all, designer minerals and metals. Sometimes we think of rocks in the ground, just boring old rocks. But if you're an engineer, you realize that rocks are not just rocks. We have just the kind of minerals and rocks and sand, just what we need to do building and engineering. Just to give you some examples, stone is used obviously for building. Then you have slate, which is very good for the tiles. Slate is very fine-grained rock, and if you bash it, you get these very convenient slates that come out just right for tiles. And then if you have a need for very beautiful stone, then you have marble. But then you can make bricks, because if you heat clay, you can make pottery or bricks. And if you combine limestone with clay, you get cement. Very convenient, very fast to make this moldable rock. Now, a lot of people would say, well, that was a lucky coincidence. If we combine limestone and clay, cool, that was lucky, we can make cement. But I think that is God's design and provision for man. And did you know that some minerals are very, very beautiful? Because glass and gemstones are minerals, but they're very beautiful minerals. Isn't it interesting? God can form a rock to be something of great beauty. That's God's power to do that. My favorite mineral is carbon, and I'll explain why. One example of carbon is a carbon pencil. Carbon, or graphite, in this case graphite. Graphite is one of the softest materials on Earth, especially some types of graphite for a very soft pencil. It's one of the softest materials, and it's also very black. Now, do you know what is the hardest material on Earth? Is diamond. And did you know that diamond is almost identical to graphite, except for one tiny chemical bond? How does God do that? How can he make two materials that are almost identical, and one is the hardest material on Earth and the other is one of the softest? One is transparent and one is black. How does he do that? That is just incredible. Another form of carbon, of course, is carbon fiber for bikes, and I use that a lot on Team GB, so that's a very beautiful form of carbon as well. But this is just an amazing contrast. And then we have designer metals. There are around 90 different metals in existence, and in fact, you can make more, because if you combine metals, You can have composite metals, so there are actually many, many types of metals. If you speak to an engineer and say, do you think there is a metal missing, like a metal that does a particular thing? And an engineer will say, no, there's nothing missing. Every type of metal you need is there. Because if you want a soft metal for guttering, you just use lead. If you want a metal for a hard coin, you use nickel. If you want something very light to make a lightweight thing, you have aluminium. If you want to conduct electricity, then you use copper. If you want to make a magnet, you use iron. If you don't want rust, you use chromium. If you want a battery, you have lithium. It's incredible. Everything, every physical thing you would ever want to do, God has given every single metal. And some of my colleagues have said to me, that's remarkable. Every kind of metal we need, it's all there. And not only that, the metal appears in the right abundance. So aluminium is very abundant, and it's one of the most useful metals. So God has given us every metal we need and given it in the right abundance. God knew exactly what technology we would ever produce and gave us every metal we would ever need. We even have some metals in our body. So I mentioned designer materials in the world. Now I come to designer plants. The atheist would say, well, we just have random plants in the world. But I think God has been very careful to give us exactly the plants that humans need for life. If you want to make really hard furniture, you can use mahogany. If you're a builder and you want fast-growing structural wood, you use pine. If you want a really strong door, then you can use oak. And by the way, English oak is stronger than Norwegian oak. And if you want a really tough wood, then you use willow. Willow is the most incredible wood. If you make a tool like a hammer and you really bash it, most woods will just crack. Or if you're playing baseball and if you don't use willow or a similar wood for baseball, the bat will just break and splinter. But God knew that we would need tools. God knew that we would play baseball. He even knew we would play cricket in England. And so he gave us the willow, a super, super tough wood. It's an incredible wood. He gave us woods that are sweet, woods that are rot-resistant, woods that are light, woods that are heavy. Lignum is 10 times heavier than balsa for the same volume. That's an incredible difference in density. And if you want a really attractive table, you can use teak. The one that really amazes me, if you do research on woods, you'll read that there are 1 or 2 very special trees. Out of thousands of types of trees, there are just 2 or 3 trees that are called musical trees or tone woods. And the reason they're called tone woods is because they are designer made to make violins, guitars, cellos, and musical instruments. Spruce is one of them. It's called a musical wood. And the atheist says, we are so lucky. This is a really lucky coincidence. Just imagine the world without these tone woods. We are so lucky. I'm really happy about this luck. But it's not luck. God put these musical trees there that we might make musical instruments. And like the metals, every type of wood that you might need for craftsmanship, for building, God gave Noah the gopher wood. And it's interesting that God told Noah what wood to use, because Noah had a choice of thousands, but God knew which wood was the best wood for Noah to use. So Noah had something that a designer like myself did not have. He had divine help, so it's kind of cheating for divine help there. Also, God has given us designer food. It's not just Genesis. It's not only in Genesis that it says God designed fruit. For man, in Psalm 104, it says God causes vegetation to grow for the service of man. It's no coincidence that fruit and vegetables are brilliantly designed for human use. I teach mechanical engineers in my university, and quite a number work for food companies. You may not realize a lot of engineers work for food companies. It's a huge industry. Millions of dollars go into producing food, and it's a very difficult thing to do. I have some lucky graduates who work in chocolate factories, and they tell me that it's really hard to make chocolate, to make it the right hardness, the right color, the right nutrition. Everything has to be set just right. And when I speak to engineers in food companies that make yogurts and flans and chocolate and other things, they tell me they are very jealous. They are very jealous of fruit because it is the ultimate snack food. And unlike engineering food, it comes beautifully packaged with far better packaging than engineers can make. You just consider a banana. A banana tells you when it is ripe. Engineers can't do that. They would love to make a package that tells you the best time to eat the food inside, but it's just too difficult. But God can do it. He's done it with the banana. And you can pull the banana skin apart with your hands. It's very easy to do, not like those supermarket packets that you have to fight with to get apart. And then the banana is the right size to hold, has the right nutrition, it's tasty. A banana has a wonderful softness when it's ripe. Engineers would love to copy that gooey softness, but it's just too difficult. And God has given us a whole range of fruit, just the right size, just the right nutrition. And fruit trees are over-designed. An apple tree does not need to produce 200 large, beautiful, tasty apples every single year. It doesn't need to do that. But God made it do that for the need of man. The same with many other types of fruit tree. And then God has also made plants for our clothing as well. There's a cotton plant there. It's amazing, isn't it, to see a cotton field with these plants come up, and you have these balls of cotton. You think, what's the point of that plant producing a ball of cotton? Well, the point is, it's for our shirts. And what's interesting for engineers is engineers have tried to produce man-made clothing material like polyester, polystyrene. And it's very humbling because engineers have never produced anything as good as cotton. Cotton is far superior as an insulator than anything man has made. It absorbs more water, so it absorbs your sweat, and it also doesn't smell as bad as man-made fibers. So always buy a cotton shirt, not a polyester shirt. But I think here it's so clear to see God's hand. I like to give this example because it's a very simple example. Grass. Sometimes the simple things shows God's goodness and God's wisdom. If you're a football player, or you've seen people play football, you sometimes can slide on your knees, or you see footballers sliding on their knees to celebrate if they scored a goal. And if a footballer slides along the ground on their knees, they might get green knees, but it never gives them a blister. It's not a problem to slide on grass. But if you speak to a sportsman, they will tell you, you must never slide on artificial grass. Engineers have been making artificial grass for 40, 50 years, and they still cannot make a single blade of grass like God makes grass. For 40 years, footballers have been screaming at engineers saying, please, 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 make your grass as soft as real grass, because we keep getting blisters and cuts and bruises. So for the last 40 years, engineers have been desperately trying to make soft grass, but they cannot do it. Engineers cannot make a single blade of grass. So there was a story last year where engineers claimed, finally, to have made some soft grass. So in Wales, a province of Great Britain, they said, okay, these engineers now said this grass is soft, so they played a rugby game on the grass, and this is what happened. It was in the news. It was on the national news. After this game of rugby, they pictured all of the rugby players, and they all had blood and blisters on their knees. And of course, they went back to the engineers, and they said, you told us that this at last, you would make soft grass. This grass is still not soft, this artificial grass. And the engineer said, yeah, but everything's got to be just right. You've got to have the right amount of water on, the right temperature. If everything's not right, then you can't, So engineers still cannot. It's very humbling trying to copy what God has designed. The very latest artificial grass, they found a way of making it fairly soft. What they do is they put real grass in the middle. And I think God looks down saying, that is cheating to do that. Did you know that there are more than 12,000 types of grass? Just grass. So farmers can get the right grass for the right livestock, and there are lots of edible grasses, rice, wheat, maize, oats, and rye. That list at the bottom, rice, wheat, maize, oats, rye, if humans did not live on Earth, those things do not make sense. What is the point of having those things if humans do not live on Earth? They're amazing foods. I have a friend in Switzerland who makes a particular type of Swiss chocolate, which is very convenient because he gives me some now and again. And he explained to me how you can make chocolate from cocoa. And I was discussing with him, and we agreed, what's the point of a plant producing cocoa if it's not for chocolate? And the same with coffee beans. These things only make sense when you can see that God made them for man. And then we come to designer animals. And there's two animals in the world that are very, very special. God made animals for man. A sheep only makes sense if you think of it being made for man, the way it produces wool. And when we read about the creation of Eve, we're told that no animal was considered to be good enough to be a companion for man. That doesn't mean that the animals weren't companions. They are companions, but they weren't good enough to be the proper companions, so Eve had to be made. Thankfully, Eve was made. But animals are still companions, and there's two particular animals that are very, very special for man. The whole of history would be different without these two animals. One is the horse, and one is the dog. If you read a history book, you will see that horses have played an incredible part in the history of man. Obviously, we take this for granted. We have our cars today, but if you go back in history, people needed horses for transport. And the back of a horse is perfectly designed for a human to sit on. Of course it is, because God designed it that we could get from A to B. And it's brilliant at transporting people, either on horseback or with a carriage. God knew that we needed horses, but not just for transport. God knew we needed them for farming, for pulling the plow. God knew that we needed them for warfare. In the First World War, about 1 million horses were used on the Allied side. We just forget how important horses were in history. And when you look at the size and shape of a horse, it is absolutely designed for human use. Horses are also unusual in that they are very trainable. They're relatively easy to train, unlike other animals. And horses also sweat quite a lot. So they're an unusual creature that can actually work quite hard. Engineers have been so impressed with the power of a horse, that in England, in English units, also used in America, the horsepower is used as the unit of power, not just for cars, but for other things, because horses are so powerful. Did you know that one healthy horse can do the work of 10 healthy men? Why employ 10 men when you can employ one horse, and the horse doesn't go on strike and complain and do other things? God did that deliberately. And of course, horses are good for pleasure as well. As I said, the whole of history would be different without the horse. I think the most wonderful creature in the world after man is the dog. Dogs are just the most incredible creatures. And when God created dogs, he knew that these would be special helpers to man. He knew that we needed these little creatures to pull loads. He knew that we needed these creatures to do amazing herding tasks. If you come to England and Wales, it's just mind-boggling what these dogs can do in the way they herd sheep. They're also very good at policing, and even they have a medical use as well. Dogs are used quite a lot in medical circumstances, and dogs love obeying instructions. I can show you my daughter. I have a daughter who's not well. She has a medical dog, this Chihuahua, and it lives with her. And the Chihuahua is very tiny, so when he sees a friend, he has to go up on his hind legs to say hello. That's an example of a medical dog. But with animals, we also see designer clothing. And wool, like cotton, wool is an amazing material, very good insulator. Isn't it amazing how God can even use an insect to make a wonderful material of silk for humans? There are millions of types of insect, but God can use this insect to make silk. This dirty creature makes one of the most beautiful, softest materials. But I want to mention two other foods that animals make. And these two foods relate to two important foods in the Bible, because the Bible mentions that milk and honey are two special foods, a land flowing with milk and honey. In England, I don't know about a Norwegian cow, but an English cow can produce 24 liters of milk in one day. To produce that milk, it drinks 100 liters of water in a day, eats 40 kilograms of grass, and it pumps 10,000 pints of blood through the udder to make that milk. So tomorrow morning, when you have a glass of milk, just remember what the cow went through to produce that milk. We take it for granted so much. But now we come to my favorite food, what I think is the most special food. I already mentioned honey. There are millions of insects in the world. Scientists don't know whether it's 3 million, 10 million. There's different types of insect. There's one single insect that makes food for man. One. And it's the bee. No other insect makes food for man. The bee could live off dirt or dung, but it just happens to make honey, which is the most amazing food. It's thought to be the only food that you can live on and have nothing else but water. It contains every nutrient that you live. So this one single insect, the bee, makes a food that happens to be the best food on earth. Is that some incredible coincidence? That's not a coincidence. That is God's provision. Sadly, supermarkets sell very cheap honey, which is mixed with other kind of cheap honeys made from sugar. But if you have proper local honey, it's absolutely delicious. One colony of bees has up to 60,000 bees. Do you know the work involved for bees to make a jar of honey? Do you know the work involved? a hive has to fly 50,000 miles and visit 2 million flowers to make one pot of honey. There was a time when God was thinking, I want to give honey to people, and honey to John the Baptist and to other people. And he thought, I know, I'll get these bees, 50,000 of them, and they'll fly millions of times, and they'll collect all these things, and that will create a jar of honey to go on your table. So we should not take this for granted when we have a jar of honey on our table. Did you know that the average worker bee in their lifetime produces 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey? So if you have a teaspoon of honey, you've just eaten the lifetime work of 12 bees. And if you don't lick that spoon clean afterwards, if you just throw it in the dishwasher, you have neglected the lifetime work of one bee. How can you neglect the lifetime work of one bee? You have to clean the spoon. But my point is, God designed the whole thing. How we take these things for granted, partly because we live in an atheistic world that ignores God's design and God's provision. Just briefly, I've written a lot about this in my books. God has given us an amazing color system, and recently we can appreciate it, the blue sky, the green land. God has made a blue sky. Why? Because it contrasts with the gray rocks, with the green grass. It would be very strange if the sky was green and the grass was green. The atheist says, that's a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. It's God's design. Green is the best background color for the flowers. The most rare color for wildflowers is blue. Makes sense, because blue dominates in the sky. These things are not a coincidence. It's the planning, the design of a great designer. And we could speak about wonderfully colorful creatures in the Garden of Eden. I think everything would have had this kind of color, but we can still find this in places around the world. God is so clever, he can turn a piece of grit, which is what happens. A pearl starts as a piece of grit, and then the creature amazingly puts hundreds of layers of calcium carbonate around and turns that grit into a pearl. I think God did that deliberately to show his power. He can turn a piece of grit into something of great beauty. And I think it's a picture of what happens when you become a Christian. You start not very beautiful, but God clothes you in the righteousness of Christ and turns you into something beautiful. As it says in Psalm 149, God beautifies the humble with salvation. I give a whole talk on birdsong. I talk about this in my book, Hallmarks of Design. Incredible beauty in birdsong. The top line is J.S. Bach. The bottom line is a blackbird. But if you spoke to a musicologist, they wouldn't know the difference between the two. And if you told them the bottom one was a blackbird, they would look very confused, because they say, but that looks just like J.S. Bach. But everything came from God. And great beauty in the sea, great beauty in the stars. The stars have incredible beauty, the variety, the color. Wherever you point a telescope in the sky, we see God's abundant design, God's abundant beauty. So we see great provision in the earth, and we see great beauty. Later in that chapter, I quoted Isaiah 45 earlier, where it said, God designed the earth to be inhabited. It's interesting how the chapter goes on to say, look to me and be saved, all you ends of the earth, for I am God, and there is no other. Not surprisingly, the God who created this earth, every detail of design, of course he loves the world, and he loved the world so much, he gave his only Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, that if we believe in him, we shall not perish, but have everlasting life. That wonderful verse from John chapter 3, verse 16. Many years ago, we had a Norwegian a young man stay in our house. He was studying. There was no connection. He just applied through an advert. And we asked him if he ever went to church, and he said no. We asked him if he knew anything, and he said, yeah, John 3:16. Someone had told him John 3:16. So it's such an important verse. I hope you're encouraged by God's goodness, not to take for granted all those good gifts that God gives you every day. I would like to thank Joe again for a wonderful conference. I actually have just started a website, profstuartburgess.com, if you want to check anything out. But it's been a wonderful conference, and I thank you very much. Thank you.